Hey everybody, and welcome to another patch breakdown. This time I'm going to be covering the StarCraft Evolution Complete 1.17 PTR notes. Now, it's been a little bit of time since we've done these, but I did some consulting on this patch, similar to the last one that I covered, and I'm pretty excited about some of the changes. As always, a disclaimer that I don't have any sort of final say in what does or does not make it in, although some changes that I suggested did in this case. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. The first thing that gets covered is that there will be some events, some tournaments that are going to go ahead and do some testing for this PTR, including the StarCraft Evolution League 1.17 PTR Opens, number 1 and number 2. By the time this comes out, number 1 will be done, but number 2 will be open for registration. So if you feel up for it, please do go ahead and register. The more, the merrier. After that, we go ahead and take a look at a new model. The main one that is going to be coming out is going to go ahead and be the Cybernetics Core. I'm a really big fan of how this came out. It has a great death animation where it sort of implodes in on itself, as well as an animation for when it's researching. Came out great. Really looking forward to seeing it in action. After that, we have the actual meat of what will be this PTR. Starting off with the Terran changes, which includes basically a mini bio rework. So first off, we have the Marine, which is going from 17.1 seconds of build time down to 16.1 seconds, and is also getting its attack period decreased, which means an attack speed increase, right? It's going to be attacking faster because the attack period is the delay between attacks. It's going to be going down from 0.69 to 0.67. However, while these are notable buffs, the nerfs are also pretty notable as well. The Stimpack attack speed bonus is going to be going from 100% down to 75%. And the attack period after Stimpack, the delay between attacks, is going to be going from 0.34 to 0.38. So this is going to be a smaller change, right? A smaller buff than this nerf is. This nerf is bigger. However, that does go ahead and lead us to the final change, which is the decrease of the U-238 shell's research time. This is Marine range, growing from 85.7 down to 64.3. This is an over 20-second decrease in the speed of U-238 or Marine range research. All in all, this is either net neutral or a small buff to the Marine. The Firebat likewise has both a buff and a nerf. Its buff is going from 17.1 down to 16.1 seconds, and its HP is coming down from 55 to 50. This one's, I think, a little harder to gauge. There are some situations where people have been using Firebats to really tank and hold off large quantities of Zerglings, and this is going to be a little bit less feasible, maybe about 9% less feasible to do. While that is true, there is also a lot of situations where you're really relying on Firebats to come out for your defense, and getting out 3 Firebats 3 seconds sooner could be something that turns out to be really impactful. Let's go ahead and take a look at the medic real quick before doing the final kind of overview. The medic here has its build time decreased from 17.1 to 16.1, which continues the overall metric of bio units coming down in terms of the amount of time that they take to produce. This ends up landing for me, I think, in a small buff territory, right? Bio has had successive nerfs coming down the line because it's been really strong and really flexible, especially at lower levels of play. So I think that it's really the case that we have finally landed at a point where they feel relatively balanced. This change, slightly buffing it, isn't the end of the world, and I think they have a really good reasoning for why they're doing it. The reasoning provided here is a whole wall of text, but which I can summarize as saying that Brood War is actually, although it represents the numbers as being 100% increase in attack speed based off of Stim, the reality is that it's 72.2%. Additionally, in Brood War, which we can go ahead and take a look at over here at Barracks, In Brood War, Barracks produces bio units pretty quickly at only 15 seconds for Marine, 15 seconds for Firebat, 19 seconds for Medic, which is a little longer. But this is all an effort to move in the direction of Brood War, as opposed to what we have now, which is a lot of adaptations to try and get the Marine, the Firebat, and the Medic to work a little bit more like we would expect them to function in a balanced state. There were a lot of changes that happened at the beginning of the mod, a lot of band-aid fixes that have kind of stuck with the mod until now, and this is an effort to get rid of some of these band-aid changes and really move in the direction of Brood War while maintaining a sense of balance. That then takes us to the Ghost. Before we get to the Ghost, we're going to do something that we did do last time, our old favorite, or our old kind of visualization here is the large buff, small buff, power neutral, small nerf, and large nerf categories. I'm going to go ahead and put all of these bio units in the small buff category. I think by far the one that didn't get touched at all, except in a positive way, is the Medic. So she's going to go ahead and hang out at the very top of the small buff category. I think the Marine is probably the one that lost the most here. I do think that the Stimpack nerf is notable. I do think that this is something that is going to bite some players quite badly. To dive into it a little further, one of the things that we've seen a lot of players, a lot of bio players do, is that they use the Marine in a way that it cannot be used at all in the world of StarCraft II, right? They've been using the StarCraft Marine to really fight 1v1 or in terms of near parity in terms of supply versus roaches. Probably even disadvantaged in terms of supply because of how supply inefficient roaches are. But Marines have been getting used, T1 Marines have been getting used to fight roaches, to fight Ravagers, to fight Stalkers and Immortals as well, in situations where you would never have imagined this to be the case if you were only using StarCraft II Marines. Firebats as well, I think, have been used in situations where Hellbats would be good, but Firebats are just so much stronger, so much earlier, right? And in addition to that, we're relatively tanky for such an early game unit. This is going to really, I think, rein in some of those big power points. And instead, I think we're going to see early massing of Marine, early massing of Firebats, early massing of Medics, and that to be where some of the power comes from. Maybe that early massing is going to allow you to still be able to do some of the things you were doing before, or at least on similar timings, but it's going to look pretty different because you will need to have more bio to accomplish what you were doing before. Both in terms of Firebats, who have less HP, as well as Marines, who are going to have a weaker stim timing. Moving on from that, we do have the Ghost. Now, this is actually one of a number of changes that are all happening on this patch, which are nerfing the length of Brood War spells, right? So here it says that it's nerfing to about 50% of their core durations. Whenever you see something referencing core is pretty much the same as Legacy, and Legacy is trying to copy Brood War numbers as close as possible into the StarCraft II engine. So in this case, many of these are coming down to about 50% of what they are in Brood War, right? In this case, this has resulted going from 37.8 to 33 normal time. I'm reading the normal time like it was the old patch notes or the old way of representing time. It's going from 27 seconds down to 23.6 seconds in the version of the game that's played competitively, which is what most people play. So this is a slightly less than 4-second nerf. It's about a 3.5-second nerf. I think that this is going to be a lot less impactful than it might be in other cases, both because it's not that big of a nerf in terms of time and in terms of proportionality, but also because StarCraft II is such a fast-paced game. Oftentimes, these spells were actually not being made full use of. If you can't take advantage of your opponent in 20 seconds, that extra 7 seconds actually doesn't help you that much, right? We've seen cases where Dark Archons, for example, would land these huge maelstroms, but the P1 players were not able to make full use of these huge maelstroms, these huge stuns, because they didn't have enough units, and no amount of length in terms of that stuns, unless you got to something truly ridiculous in the 30-40 second stun range, was ever really going to help you tackle that many enemy units with a small number of units for you. The Ghost is actually a little bit bigger of a nerf compared to some of the other ones, because the Ghost already has such poor damage to begin with. You were seeing situations where Ghosts were being used around the main or around the natural to shut down Liberators and then to try to kill them. And their damage was so bad and will continue to be so bad that it's possible that this lockdown duration, it might truly be missed. That said, I don't think it'll be a huge change, but the Ghost is maybe one where it will be a little bit more noticeable as compared to some others. Let's go ahead and find this guy, put him at small nerf. And probably one of the bigger small nerfs, I imagine. Keeping on going, we have the Wraith here, which has an increase to its burst laser attack range. That is to say, its ground attack, going from 4 up to 5. I think this is going to be a very nice buff onto a unit that was already relatively viable. I'm not sure if we should put it into a truly large buff category or a small buff category, or at the top of the small buff category. But it is going to be quite good, I think, because the Wraith was already viable. In this case, they're trying to make the Wraith more viable in terms of harass, in terms of getting at spellcasters, getting at Nidus Worms, picking off workers, a lot of situations where there is going to be some defense already. I think this might land, there's a chance this lands the Wraith at about somewhere just under overpowered, call it overtuned. And so I'll go ahead and call this a large buff, but it's not huge, right? And I don't think it's going to be extremely overpowered. Let's go ahead and find the Wraith, put it in large buff. Now there's the Battle Cruiser. The Battle Cruiser has some really big changes coming in here. It's having its build cost decrease from 375, 275 down to 350, 250. It's having its HP decrease from 550 down to 500. And it's also having a lot of nerfs in terms of its damage, going from 36 plus 8 versus mechanical down to 34. It's also having its growth per attack damage upgrade decreased from +4 down to +3. This is going to be one of those changes where I think the direction of the change is positive, right? It is moving closer to its Brood War stat line. This 500 is in fact its exact Brood War stat line, and its attack is somewhere I think in the mid-20s. However, it is having its build cost decreased to kind of try and keep up with the fact that the StarCraft II battlecruiser has an entire additional teleporting ability. I'm positive on the direction of the change. I think this might be a net nerf to a unit that already wasn't always viable. I think the more I take a look at this, and the balance team might not love the fact that this didn't come across when I was consulting on this change in particular, because when I was looking at the change initially, it struck me that this change, the build cost coming down as much as it did, especially coming down from what was 400, 300 2 patches ago, really left me thinking that this might be a healthy place for the battlecruiser. And I'm now starting to think that the damage could have come up to 37 or even 38 base damage, based on some breakpoints that I'm not going to get into here, but which affect a lot of matchups against Protoss in terms of Tempest, in terms of Void Ray, and in terms of its siege breaking ability versus siege tanks. We're going to go ahead and put this in the small nerf category. Initially, I thought, and in my consultation, I thought that it might have been power neutral instead. We're going to go ahead and put it in small nerf at the top of small nerf because it's actually not that big of a nerf. I still think it's not too far away from being power neutral. Onto the Zerg changes, the Mutalisk going from 4 to 4.5 attack range. The Mutalisk is in such a complicated position. It's a tough unit to balance. It masses really easily. Once it's massed, it can be really terrifying to use. At the same time, when it's not massed, it gets shut down really easily by a lot of different units. In particular, it gets shut down really hard by Phoenix. I think this is a good change. I think this is a noticeable buff, right? I don't think we've seen any huge buffs. I'm not sure we're going to see any huge buffs. Within the context of that kind of diminished range, I'm going to call this a large buff. And I do think that it is... Do I think that it is bigger? This is a change that's going to 4 to 5, and this is a change that's going to 4 to 4.5. But the ways in which these units are masked makes this not as easy as you would think to distinguish between the two, even though numerically this is, of course, clearly and obviously, and even proportionally bigger. But the way that mutas tend to mass up mean that it's not as cut and dry, but I am going to leave it like that. The Devourer, interestingly, this is extending its length. This is calling it interestingly, when you read I just for kicks read the Korean version of these patch notes, and it calls it an interesting or a funny coincidence. And I agree. Out of sheer coincidence, the acid spore effect of Devourers is being increased in length rather than decreased in length, even though for most other units, it was thought that the spell length was too long. In this case, I think this is good. The Devourer is never seen. Anything that buffs the Devourer is probably a point that moves it in the direction of being a more balanced unit and being a more valuable and viable unit. This happens to buff it in the direction of Brood War, which is even better. As we go ahead and move forward, we take a look at the Queen. Queen, of course, mainly we're taking a look at Ensnare. Ensnare has both the decreased effect duration. In this case, it is a very notable nerf. But it also has a nerf in terms of Ensnare no longer affecting the attack speed of units that have turrets, right? So this includes the siege tanks, both Brood War and StarCraft II, as well as the Goliath, the Hellion, the Hellbat, the Cyclone, the Liberator, the Immortal, and the Colossus. This is to emulate something that is the case in Brood War, where siege tanks and Goliaths don't have their attack speed decreased by Ensnare. I think this is a good change because it's moving us in the direction of Brood War. That being said, Ensnare is a very useful spell, and a spell that I think was appropriately tuned. So I'm wondering if this maybe is going to have a detrimental effect for Zerg. This is one that really could, where even some of the upper range of the spell was finding use in terms of allowing Hydras, allowing, to a lesser extent, Zerglings to catch up to fast-moving units, such as boosting Metavacs or Cyclones. Let's go ahead and take a look back over here. We skipped the Devourer change. Let's go ahead and move this guy over here. This is a very small buff in terms of what the unit needs. Maybe it's a bigger buff than these two, but I would say it's definitely a smaller buff than the Medic. Taking a look at the Queen, we are going to go ahead and move her up into, if I can do my alphabet correctly, we are going to go ahead and move her into, I'm going to go ahead and call this a tier above any of the other nerfs that we have seen so far. I'm going to go ahead and call this a large nerf. It's not a huge nerf. right? None of these are going to be, I hope and I think, truly huge buffs or huge nerfs. I think I'm in agreement with a lot of community sentiment that StarCraft EVO is and has been moving in the direction of becoming a much more balanced game. And so hopefully we can stay away from doing huge changes to the balance between factions. That said, we now move on to another big change, which is the Defiler. And this is a change where, because the Defiler isn't seen super often, there's a chance that this change isn't going to be super impactful. That said, it is potentially going in the wrong direction, where a unit that hasn't quite found its niche in terms of being super valuable, in terms of only occasionally seeing representation, is getting a nerf, whereas maybe we would want to be buffing this unit. Let's go ahead and put this, I'm going to say, in the small nerf category. In terms of impact, it's a small nerf. We could say that it is just as big of a nerf as the Queen. However, in terms of its impact, I'm going to put it at the bottom of the small nerf category, closest to being a large nerf. But I don't think it's one that I think the player base is going to feel that much, precisely because the Defiler isn't used as often. Now, this is a unit that is not going to show up on our tier list because it is a StarCraft II unit. It is only being touched in order to kind of bring it in line with the functionality of the Dark Archon, which is going to come immediately afterwards. It is what the two have in common is that they have an ability to take over an enemy unit. In this case, if you take a worker and you start building a nexus, you start building something that is going to eventually allow you to use enemy units, essentially have an entire other army, it's now going to use its own independent supply pool, right? Food for Terran units, control for Zerg units, and Psi for Protoss units. This is technically a buff to Dark Archon, which previously made you have to use your own supply. However, there was also some versions of this change where I think further in the past it didn't use any supply at all. I think this is something of a, if you have the time to take a Dark Archon or to take an Infestor, bring it all the way to your opponent's base, take a worker, and then escape with the worker somehow all the way out of your opponent's base over to a base that you hold safely to build buildings and then units, there was a more efficient way for you to win that game, right? And so this is actually a change that I think basically has no impact on competitive balance at all. That said, let's go ahead and take the Dark Archon and put it in the smallest of small buffs. It is technically a small buff. It is as close to being power neutral as possible. Now, let's go ahead and move on to a change that is much more complicated than that. We have the Scout here, which is having essentially a mini rework, which is, I think, might be noted in here, its third mini rework, right? There was a long kind of ongoing rework where there was a lot of small changes over time, which definitely eventually added up to being a rework. Then there was a large rework where it got buffed pretty noticeably in terms of damage, where it was previously only doing 10 plus 5 to light. It went to doing 4x4 plus 1 to light, which adds up to 4 plus 1, 5 times 4, which is 20 damage to light units, as opposed to only 15 to light units. However, it had its range decreased from 5 range, which was one of the semi-small changes that buffed the Scout in its original version over time. It got nerfed down to only having 4 range. I think this change really failed in terms of its goals, because the goal was to make the Scout a fully viable unit. And instead of doing that, we ended up with a Scout that was still very niche. It was maybe seen even less often than the version that was slowly buffed over time. I think that this is largely because although its damage went up and its power points became even stronger, its flexibility went down dramatically when it lost its range, right? It made it much harder for it to stand up to any sort of even very limited engagement as it tried to look for harass. It made it really difficult for it to find any sort of small moment where it could dive units that maybe it loses to 1-to-1, but it wins in terms of maybe a massed engagement when a unit is isolated or a unit is out of position. All of these sort of marginal matchups, the Scout got nerfed in, and so it was incredibly difficult to use the Scout effectively. If you can't tell, I consulted on this change extensively. The changes that we've arrived at here is a little bit of a nerf in terms of damage. We're going 7x2 plus 2 versus light, right? So that's 18 damage versus light total. This is also a nerf in terms of its flat damage. 4x4 is 16, 7x2 is 14. However, its damage to units with armor is about the same, where 4x4 turns into 3x4 versus units with 1 base armor, and 7x2 turns into 6x2, and both of these add up to or multiply up to 12. However, from that nerf, in terms of damage, we move on to a lot of buffs over here. In other areas, we have an increase in terms of its scaling, whereas it used to not scale at all. Instead, it had only 0.5 damage increase per upgrade. Now we're moving up to a typical +1 damage per upgrade. This means that the Scout is not going to fall off a cliff as soon as it gets into the later portions of the game, where you would have any sort of upgrades at all. We also are going to decrease the attack period, which means that there is less time in between attacks, which means it's going to be attacking faster, from 1.25 to 1.12. And we are going to be most notably increasing its attack range. The Scout is a really difficult unit to work with because it was so bad in Brood War, it is essentially never used in a competitive setting. It has markedly few games, right? To the point that when it ever is used in games, it is specifically notable, right? And usually it is used as a form of BM, of bad manners in a game, to display just a total dominance in a game, or to try to imply that the opponent should surrender. Within StarCraft EVO, we have for a long time been trying to move the Scout in a direction where it is both healthy, somewhat related to its identity in Brood War as a unit that is a flexible attacker that is capable of scouting, which is an identity that, even though that's what was intended, it was never capable of that identity at all. And the confluence of these two goals, having a unit that is both healthy and also somehow lives up to an identity that it itself was never able to fulfill in the first place, has made it a really complex unit to work with. I have faith that this is going to be potentially one of the last reworks. It may need some touches if it's a little overtuned in some areas or a little undertuned in others, but I have faith that this can be a version of the Scout that allows it to truly be effective, right? It is keeping a lot of its strength while adding flexibility. Specifically, it's keeping a lot of its strength against things like Zerglings and against things like Marines and Hydras. We'll have to see if that turns out to be an issue, but I have faith that this can be a version of the Scout that is strong enough to be a viable opener and a viable unit. As we continue on to Carrier, which is a functionality change that moves it closer to Brood War. Interceptors are going to be launching projectiles now instead of firing lasers the way they do in StarCraft II. However, interceptors firing projectiles means that it can overkill, and in fact, There are examples of it online, overkilling dramatically against Zerglings. Now, I think this is a good change because the carrier has been potentially a little bit too strong when we've seen it in competitive play. However, there is no way to deny that I think it is a nerf overall. It's a nerf that moves it closer to Brood War, and it is a nerf that is probably positive for the game, but it is noticeable, and it is maybe a cut above any of the other nerfs in the small nerf category. So I'm going to put it in large nerf. It's not... It's maybe a larger nerf than the Queen nerf. I'm a little uncertain, but I'm going to say that it is. I'm going to say that it's a larger nerf than the Queen nerf. We also didn't put the Scout here. I'm going to go ahead and put it... I'm going to put it at the lower end of large buff, but I think it is a cut above some of these changes that we see here. There is a chance that the combination of the bio buffs amounts to being a larger buff than I anticipate, but I don't think it will be. Which brings us finally to the Arbiter. The Arbiter is going to go ahead and have its stasis field effect decreased, a change that I think is not going to have that big of an effect, right? This is one of the key examples of a spell that was so long that a lot of the times the situation had completely resolved itself by the time units came out of stasis. And so you would have P1 units just waiting around to be able to start attacking the half of the army that the Arbiter put into stasis, because they already defeated the half of the army that was still outside of stasis. So I think this is going to be a small nerf, despite the fact that the numbers-wise and proportionally, it is a pretty noticeable nerf. Let's go ahead and toss the Arbiter onto the small nerf category. Let's go ahead and put him... Yeah, I think at the very top of the small nerf category, because it is that small of a nerf. And that takes us to the bug fixes and other changes section. I don't believe there's anything too noticeable here. Interceptors going up by 10%. Some model size changes are pretty big. I don't think this one is, because basically no one is actually targeting interceptors by hand. I think there are some command card position changes that might be relevant to some folks. Really looking forward to it being the same as the StarCraft II layout, but overall, I think that's pretty much all of the relevant changes. This change right here, I know Steadfast ran into, and so maybe he'll be happy to see this change as an observer, as a caster. And that's going to go ahead and be all for now. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for hanging out, and I hope to see you all in either the tournament or in the chat, taking advantage of enjoying all of the StarCraft Evolution and the PTR tournaments that we have ahead of us. Thanks, and I hope you all have a great time out there.